so welcome back everyone for the last panel of the day. So this is going to be a more relaxed discussion, no formal talk or presentation. It's going to just be a chat with the prominent speakers about the moral stakes of germline genome editing. So we're going to talk about something rather specific, although we can start a bit broader maybe. So my name is Alberto Giubilini. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference with Andrew and José. I'm based at Uehiro Institute, which partly funds this event. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce the two panelists, and then I'm going to start off the discussion with a question, and then Heloise, you met earlier, is going to follow up with the questions. Okay, so the two panelists are Professor Julian Savulescu, who many of you here know. He's the Chancellor Professor in Medical Ethics at the National University of Singapore, where he directs the Center for Biomedical Ethics. Well, I was about to say, he's one of the most famous and important bioethicists, but if you want, I will skip that part about how much you wrote. So it's one of the most prominent figures in the debate enhancement. He introduced the concept of procreative beneficence, for example, in the literature. I have a list of all your distinguished professorships and honorary doctorates. Okay, good. Oh, it's very modest. And then we have Benjamin Hurlbut, who is associate professor at the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. He's trained in science technology studies. With a focus on the history of the modern bioethical and life science. Should I start?
Good enough for me too.
Okay. Oh, he published many things. That's a good summary about experiments in democracy, human embryo research, and the politics of bioethics. And he's co-editor of Perfecting Human Futures. So that's very relevant to the current discussion. So the discussion is going to be about the moral stakes of germline genome editing. But I think the first question here, because we're going to do a bit more of philosophy now, and philosophers often start off with definitions, which is a bit frustrating for many people sometimes. But I should probably start by asking both of the panelists how they would define human enhancement in the first instance. So what do you take enhancement to be? If you can give us some examples, and then we can get into the more ethical discussion. So Julian, we start with you. How do you define human enhancement?
Yeah, so enhance means to make better. So in terms of gene editing, it's to modify genes to make humans better in some way. And many people draw a distinction between enhancement on the one hand and treatment or prevention of disease on the other, even though when you cure a disease, you make the person better. But many people draw this bright line between health on one side and disease on the other, or disability on the other. And enhancement is about changing biology, in this case genes, to move people within the normal range to a more desirable state. So there are different kinds of enhancement: cognitive enhancement, physical enhancement. You're all familiar with doping in sport. Moral enhancement, enhancement of love, motivational enhancement, mood enhancement. All of these aim to put somebody at a more desirable point according to that value parameter. The proponents of enhancement, such as myself, argue that the definition of disease is arbitrary. For example, intellectual disability, such as Down syndrome, is defined as an IQ 2 standard deviations below the mean, which is the bottom 2%. Why the bottom 2%? Why not the bottom 15%? Why not the bottom 50%? That is just a historical choice. So we argue that what matters is not where you fall on a statistical curve, but whether the genes that you have are associated with some valued property, such as well-being. That's a welfarist account of human enhancement, or more moral behaviour. That's a form of moral bioenhancement. And the second point, which is obvious to all of you, is that even if you're normal, you can still be disadvantaged. And one of the premises of the enhancement movement is this Darwinian view that humans all are different. Some of us are short, some of us are tall, some of us are, have better impulse control, some of us have worse. Some of us are more prone to addiction, some are more prone to anger, and so on. None of you, I can look looking around the room, will ever win 100 metres in the Olympics, no matter how much you were trained, no matter what you did, what you ate, what environment you had. That's because you just don't have the genetic potential to win the 100 metres. But the 100 metres is just one thing that humans value. Everything about us, not only the diseases that we're prone to, but also the traits that we value, has some genetic contribution. It's not determined by genes, but there is some genetic contribution. And the Enhancement project is about trying to correct natural inequality. So we heard before about racism and some misuse of science. It's also true that not only do individuals differ, but races differ in terms of the genetics that they start with. So I'm in Singapore now, there is an Asian Genome project because Asian population experiences different genetic propensities to disease. And the use of Caucasian samples is not that relevant, not ideally relevant to the treatment and prevention of disease in the Asian population. Now, the degree to which other traits differ between different races, I'm not qualified to discuss. But it's certainly true that we all start life with genetic advantages and disadvantages, both in terms of disease and in terms of non-disease traits like intelligence, physical ability, longevity. Some people are extremely lucky, they live to 120. Most of us won't have that genetic potential. Is that enough?
Yeah, thank you very much. Ben?
Okay. So it was good you asked the philosopher first, because I'm going to play the social scientist and be annoying with how I approach a definition. And that is that I want to take, I want to take this notion of enhancement and treat it as something that's abroad in the social world, right? And so if we look, we don't begin with the question, can we define it in a kind of decontextualized way, but actually how is it used and what significance does it have and in what sort of context? It seems to me there are three things that are worth pointing to. That it is evaluative, that it's regulative, and that it's contextual, okay? So it's evaluative in the following sense, in precisely the ways that Julian just pointed to. There is some conception of better, and that it speaks to better and worse, right? There's a notion of improvement, there's maybe a notion of perfectibility, the word purity has emerged today in a lot of presentations and so forth, the purity and impurity. And the corollary, of course, is deficiency and defect. And it's worth noting that the making of these kinds of distinctions, we can have a conversation about whether they're meritorious or not, how they get made, who they get made by, et cetera, but the making of these distinctions does important work. So I can't remember who it was who said that once you start looking for defects, you get good at looking for defects and you see them everywhere. So the project of the discovery of the defect is a corollary to the ideas of enhancement or enhanceability that are abroad. So it's evaluative, right? But it's also regulative. So Julian pointed out how this distinction, which he wants to problematize between therapy and enhancement, has been a quite fundamental distinction in discussions around genetic engineering, but it sort of goes beyond that, for at least 50 years. That concept is regulative, not just in the sense that it has been deployed to distinguish between, sort of acceptable and unacceptable targets. So the US National Academies wrote a quite influential report around genome editing and said that, well, there are certain circumstances in which, heritable genome editing, the genetic modification of gametes or embryos such that those modifications would be inherited by subsequent generations, there are certain circumstances where that would be appropriate, but only where it's, quote, medically necessary, right? Where there's a sort of medical warrant for serious medical conditions. But I think about that not just as setting limits on appropriate or inappropriate uses, but also as a sort of construction of medicine itself. So there's a sort of professional identity, right, and a kind of demarcation of what's within and beyond the boundaries of appropriate professional practice. The state is itself implicated in some way if it's an agent constructing and delegating to that professional community certain forms of authority and deference to certain forms of expertise and so forth. So seeing the way in which a boundary like that gets deployed and is constitutive of important loci of sort of moral authority and judgment seems to me to be pretty important. As one way in which, and I think we're going to talk about regulation later, one of the ways in which this sort of conception is itself regulative. Okay, but then the third thing is that it's contextual. And Julian suggested that constructions of disease are arbitrary. You know, where you fall in the bell curve, you draw the line and say this side is disease and that side is normal variation or whatever, that's a sort of arbitrary demarcation. Okay, we can have an argument about that, but definitely there is an arbiter that's drawing a distinction along a bell curve. But it's also worth noting that there's an arbiter who has constructed that bell curve in the first place, decided that this complex three-dimensional space can be represented in 2 dimensions by, you know, putting this at one end and that at the other end of the spectrum. That's the sort of salient thing that's worth mapping. And, you know, calling that disease and then drawing distinctions, say, between therapy and enhancement that place you on the right side versus the wrong side of warranted intervention. So to make the point about the contextuality and you might say arbitrariness, but the pretty, I would argue, morally important arbitration associated with that arbitrariness of disease versus something else, of treatment versus enhancement. Let me use the one example of genetically engineered human beings that we have, which is this case of the genetically engineered children in China. And so the target in that case was a T-cell receptor gene that basically with a certain deletion in that gene is in principle sort of renders a person immune to HIV infection. Okay, so the idea of that genetic change was to immunize these children against susceptibility to HIV. Why would you want to do that? Well, there was the father in each of the families that were the subject of the experiment were HIV positive. They were treated for HIV. They had, you know, they've done detectable viral load because they're on antiretrovirals and so on and so forth. It's not necessarily in fact, there isn't probably any higher risk of HIV infection for those children than anybody else in the population. We have other, maybe better ways to do this. There was no risk of transmission in the context of IVF because it's quite straightforward to prevent transmission in that context and so forth. But he undertook this, and part of the rationale was, well, you can't select for this trait in these people because they don't have it. Like, it's a variant that exists in the human species, but doesn't exist in these couples, or even really actually in this ethnic group that from which the experimental subjects were drawn. And so it's, you know, natural or whatever, but it needs to be introduced artificially. You know, the reason that it was possible to recruit these people to participate in this study was because HIV, being HIV positive in China, is seriously disabled, let's say. It has, and you can say this is because of social stigma, not because of the biological condition of being HIV positive. But why would we ever distinguish those anyway? Since when do you ever have a sort of biological condition that is decontextualized from some sort of social context? Its social meaning may be unimportant to its manifestation, may be exceedingly important. Nevertheless, it's present. And so, in the criminal prosecution of He Zhenghui, the scientist who undertook this project, several of the couples wrote letters to the court, which was not a risk-free undertaking, right? Several of them wrote letters to the court, essentially defending his project. And one of them, a sentence from one of these letters, I think is very striking. So they explain that we participated in this not because we were, you know, coerced, not because we were ignorant, not because we were exploited in some sort of way, at least not by this particular scientist. And we also recognize that there is no problem with avoiding biological transmission. we needed this cure, this genetic cure, in order to protect our child from the sort of effect that we suffer as HIV positive people in this particular context. And so what they say, and this is quoting from the letter, we recognize that this intervention, namely preventing transmission of HIV in the context of IVF, can cure disease, but it cannot cure prejudice. Our participation in the experiment was indeed forced, but we weren't coerced by any person in particular. We were coerced by society. So is this a treatment or an enhancement? And for that matter, is it a disease? Because definitely you can't displace this particular disease from the social context of which it's part and put it in a pathology textbook or something like that. And yet at the same time, to suggest that that dimension of the disease should be left out of the picture seems like completely untrue to the actual real circumstance of the people who are seeking medical treatment for their disease. It was a cure, right? And they use that language. And so, to come back to this treatment enhancement distinction, I think the fact that one can't draw a nice, clean, bright line that one can use to sort of defer to in rendering judgment about what's appropriate and inappropriate is not some indication that it's meaningless and arbitrary and therefore one can throw out that project altogether, but rather that one has to understand that the very act of drawing that line is laden sort of morally, institutionally, culturally, and politically with a whole bunch of stuff that tends to get elided in the drawing of that line, and that those elements of context simply cannot be excluded from the picture because those are human life itself.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
Yeah. So I saw the protocol for this experiment, and it was actually called genetic vaccination.
Right.
It wasn't about curing disease, it was about preventing HIV. Now, there are many, many projects funded by Gates and others in Oxford, elsewhere, to develop vaccines for HIV. Nobody thinks that this is a bad project. What they do think is that using gene editing to achieve that is wrong because of the risk of what are called off-target mutations, that is damaging the DNA away from the target site. So that was the problem with his experiment, not the fact that he was attempting to genetically vaccinate. If gene editing was safe, there would be no difference between that and the administration of one of these protein vaccines or whatever the current vaccines are. So another important feature of the genetic enhancement debate is people draw a deep distinction between intervening at the genetic level and intervening at the protein level or intervening at the social level. They seem to think that there is something special about genetic modification. Now, there are two things that are special about it. One is that it's risky at the moment, and the second thing is it's passed on to the next generation, which means your children are vaccinated against HIV if it's effective and it's safe. So apart from those two differences, it seems to me there's a kind of genetic exceptionalism around genetic enhancements as opposed to other enhancements like vaccination or education or whatever enhancement.
Yeah, so I'm very wary of a whole set of distinctions that you just drew, Julian, between, say, the genetic and the social, since what I was just pointing out was that the genetic intervention was a social intervention. In this context, you might say was a primarily social intervention, except it was a primarily genetic intervention. The drawing of these kinds of distinctions, it makes it easier for us to conceptualize the technologies and the states of the technologies as disembedded, decontextualized, sort of abstractions that dislocate them from forms of human meaning and forms of social relations that are actually at the very core. So what is significant? Genetic exceptionalism, I mean, we can have a discussion about whether there is some kind of genetic set, but what's significant of the fact of a genetic intervention versus a somatic intervention, maybe a transitory somatic, even a permanent somatic intervention? Well, I would say that one important dimension of it is that it entails a form of human relations that is different than the relation to oneself as a body in which one invites or doesn't invite intervention, because it involves procreation, right? And that is a a very fundamental difference. Whether it's a morally significant difference or not, that's a question. But that is a dimension of human relations that if we just say, well, I mean, we can draw an analogy from X to Y to Z, and therefore we can elide that dimension of human relations from the picture and just sort of not talk about it. It is a quite profound dislocation of something that is about as central to human life as you could possibly get, and something that is about as thickly contextual and culturally and morally and politically and legally, and to keep the list going later, as you can possibly get, so that those things that make it complex and important need not be taken into account because you make a move to a particular sort of abstraction. It seems to me that there is a construction of better and worse there, and construction of maybe what enhanced reason is about these sorts of problems that is definitely contestable and certainly should be the subject of discussion instead of just leapfrogged over altogether. So, I mean, it seems to me that if one thinks of one of the things we're talking about here is the sort of idealization in the sense of abstraction of human biological or genealogical relations to render them a particular kind of object of scientific, medical, legal, political, etc. intervention. And precisely one of the lessons that surely should be learned from the history of eugenics is that that project is about as contextualized as you can possibly get. And it was precisely that project of decontextualization that we, the experts, could see the core stuff, the people starting Alex's journals and writing the scientifically robust, objective articles about things, were engaged in a particular kind of project of elision that, I mean, in retrospect, was pretty bad news, I would say. So I would be very worried about engaging in that project of elision as a starting point for asking questions about what's at stake here.
Okay, thank you. Heloise?
Yes, thank you. So as you were discussing, I think you addressed some of the points that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to draw attention particularly to the issues relating to germline gene editing, and to ask whether that raises particular issues or not. I'm worried I'm going to have a very quick answer to that, possibly, but are there particular issues there? You started to address that, but also in thinking about specifically inherited genetic modification, is that where we might want to think about what, if we do think, if the view is that it doesn't make a difference or that there would be cases that are acceptable, where do you draw the line? And is it it may be difficult to draw the line between therapy and enhancement, but people can have different views about what they think, or what they think would be better when you think about what would be a better for someone's life. People can have different views. So is there a concern in having the decision made by someone else for the future child, as opposed to having a decision made about your own health? Be interested in hearing your views on that.
So we talked about what is better, and obviously there's a huge disagreement about what is better. The deaf community, or some members of the deaf community, argue deafness is a difference, not a disability, and the disadvantage is socially constructed. Some people argue that they're better off with 3 limbs rather than 4 limbs. We heard the view before that you articulated that children with Down syndrome have a good quality of life, or can have a good quality of life. So there's a lot of disagreement. So one way to deal with disagreement is just let individuals decide for themselves. So you want to take this drug to make you live longer, or to make you smarter, or to make you stronger, and it has risks. You weigh them up and you decide. The problem is with children, fetuses and embryos, they can't decide. So in these cases, you need to have a robust definition of what better is. So an example of that is the Jehovah's Witnesses are a denomination of Christianity that believe you should not take blood. And if you don't take blood, you'll enjoy eternal paradise. They also refuse blood transfusions even when it's necessary to save their child's life. Now, what happens in these cases is doctors take this to court, and the court decides, well, is this view, appropriate to impose on a child? And generally, courts will authorise a blood transfusion to save the child's life, because even though they will allow adults to refuse blood transfusions and die, they don't believe that this is a plausible conception of better for that child. And the same would apply to other disagreements. If a deaf couple said, well, we want to have a deaf child that will be a valued member of our community, gene edit the child to be deaf. We then have to face the decision, well, is it deafness, the value of deafness really in the eye of the beholder? Or is this going to be like the blood transfusion case? If somebody says, well, I've got one child with Down syndrome, I'd like to have another child with intellectual disability, I want to gene edit the child to have an IQ of 60, is that a plausible conception of the good life? So when it comes to children, the state has to make some decision about what the reasonable boundaries to choice are. Psychopathy is highly heritable. Heritability of psychopathy is 0.8. Somebody says, I want to have a psychopathic child because they'll be a great boxer or a great CEO or a successful CEO or a rich CEO, edit the embryo, then I think we have to make a decision. So unfortunately, we're going to have to get off the fence of cultural and ethical relativism and make some decisions about what is plausibly better for children. And indeed we do. So during the Zika epidemic, Public Health England, the CDC, both issued advice to people, not just information, advice that if you've been to a country that has Zika, such as Brazil, delay conception for 3 months in order to avoid congenital Zika and microcephaly and intellectual disability. The child that you will have in 3 months' time is different to the child that you would have now, different sperm and egg. So what the CDC said, and Public Health said, you should have the child without intellectual disability if you can. Right? Because it's worse to have intellectual disability. It's a bad thing. That's why we develop treatments and preventions, and that's why we publicly fund Down syndrome screening. And that's why the CDC issues that advice, because it's just not a plausible conception of the good life to say starting off life in that way is equally likely to lead to a flourishing life as starting off life with microcephaly and intellectual disability. So that's the reality of most people's views about the limits to choice, that there are kind of better and worse lives. That's not to say all of us could end up with dementia or a car accident, head trauma, and our faculties diminish and we will need more support. So how we treat people with these conditions is quite separate to how we choose to bring into existence or what we choose to treat at an embryonic level. So that's going to be the limit. What is objectively, someone said we shouldn't talk about it objectively, but what is objectively a better or worse life? And I think that's going to be the challenge to society now that we're in this postmodernist, relativist position where it's all in the eye of the beholder. If you believe that, you should be able to deafen or disable your embryo because that's what you think is a better life.
What eye would it be held in, if not that of a beholder? Or put slightly to put slightly differently, to what source ought we go for the answer to the question of the good, if not to the process of rendering those kind of difficult judgments ourselves as best we can as political communities? I mean, one answer to that question is through a philosophical machinery for the arrival at what the operators of that philosophical machinery determine to be the objectively better form of philosophical machinery for arriving at judgments. They're good, fine. I mean, that's fine. I'm all in favor of the development and deployment of those kind of philosophical machineries, and then of other philosophical machineries to offer alternatives and debate about those and publication in journals of perspectives on how one should think about these kinds of questions, and et cetera, et cetera. But of course, that is one just very little tiny, very esoteric community in that wider human community. I mean, as you were talking about Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusion, I was thinking about German regulation, a period in which Germans sought to regulate the exercise of circumcision, for precisely the same reasons. Stopping the parents from mutilating the child, where that quote unquote mutilation was itself a feature of a very important and meaningful feature of a religious and cultural tradition that also raised fundamental constitutional questions in Germany about how one should understand the exercise of religion and the right relationship between the state and that fundamental dimension of freedom of conscience. I mean, that fundamental liberty that the state exists to protect. And Carlos just gave us a talk about other moments in which there are judgments about what children should or should not be subjected to, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's not to say that these aren't hard questions, absolutely, and it's not to say that questions of the good shouldn't be asked. Absolutely, they should be asked. But surely those questions themselves are embedded within those culturally situated, historically, traditionally situated capacities for deliberation and reason that ultimately belong to us. And it is our task to do those as best we can, and definitely we will make mistakes, and definitely we will look back on things that we did before and say, boy, did we get it wrong. And yet, to say, well, just saying that somehow societies should talk about it and figure it out is cultural relativism. I mean, I don't buy that for a second.
Well, I mean, just the circumcision example is a good one. So my colleague Brian says that all male circumcision, all female circumcision is child abuse, regardless of whether it's for religious reasons or not. Some people mount an argument that circumcision is good for your health, lower rates of HIV. Now that's a scientific question that we can settle with scientific research. Another argument is that, and this is my view, is that...
Is it? I mean, does the relationship of one to one's religious and cultural community fall under the category of...
sorry, the HIV issue, whether it reduces...
Okay. Just narrowly specifically.
Yeah, the health argument in favour of it. But my view is that we ought to regulate it and ensure that if it's going to occur, it should occur safely. The circumcision is a dangerous procedure. You can have accidental amputation of the penis. Children have died as a result of religious practices of circumcision, where the rabbi has cold sores around his mouth and sucks the end of the bleeding penis, transmits herpes, the child dies of herpes encephalopathy. Now that's appalling. So my own view is we ought to adopt a harm reductionist view and ensure that it's done by professionals in a sterile and competent way. Now, that's to say that we can give arguments. We don't just have to appeal to the value of religion. It's a deep and complex issue about whether the Germans were right or they were wrong. And simply saying that it's important in certain religions and it's contextually embedded is not sufficient to answer the question. You need good science about its risks and its benefits, and then you need to have an ethical discourse about the arguments, and then you get to a policy. That's just the lesson of this whole eugenics debate. You need good ethics and you need good science. There's no simple solution to any of these issues. If gene editing had been sufficiently safe, genetic vaccination, in my view, would be similar to vaccination of a newborn with the current vaccine. But that's what we need to sort of argue about. And I think, there is also, one of the questions we're going to get asked is, what do we learn from history? We learn from history, humans have the capacity for great good. They have the capacity for great evil. They have strengths. They have a lot of limitations. They need laws. They need incentives. They need disincentives. And they're all also prone to ideology. And what we have today in academic circles is largely an anti-eugenicist ideology, without being able to see the strengths and weaknesses of the different positions. So, that's what I learned from history, and I think that in this case, the circumcision case is a great one. I don't know what the answer to the circumcision issue is, but it's certainly not one that you can just write a single line.
Can I ask a question? Can I take this in a different direction, if I may? So let's say we're in a future world and it's very easy to produce an embryo through IVF. So this is what everyone does. You have maybe 100 embryos, put them through some sort of supercomputer, and you can edit them in so many different ways. You can decide that one is going to be a bit higher, have a higher, greater height. So you can do things like editing against HIV, but you can also edit for just a whole range of all sorts of different traits that we might think would lead to a better life. So my question is, let's say you can do this with extraordinary possibilities that are not possible now. Do you think anything would be lost? Anything would be negative? Or what would be negative in this kind of approach to procreation? So you can have regulation, so we can have a discussion and we can say this is better and this is
The
worse.
biggest issue in gene editing is not its safety. That will be resolved. Okay. We just did a paper in Nature that shows most of the conditions that we suffer for are what are called polygenic, many genes contributing. And we did an estimate that if you edited the top 10 variants that were actually causative, the common diseases like diabetes, heart disease, depression, Alzheimer's disease, you could essentially eliminate these diseases. Now, even if those projections, statistical predictions are out, there's still enormous capacity to reduce disease. But the same thing would apply to IQ. We estimated we had to take it out of the paper because it was too controversial. You could add 75 IQ points. If all the causal variants, if you took the top 10 causal variants associated, if there were causal variants, it's accounting for the genetic difference.
This nature made you take that out.
It was just too difficult to get past the reviewers. So the point is that
I know one of the reviewers that made you take that out.
these
It was because it was controversial. That he wrote a review that said it was scientifically problematic.
Okay, so that's not my main point. The main point is that the issue is not going to be the magnitude of change or the safety. The issue is going to be what's called pleiotropy, right? That unlike single genes, that disorders that have a clear connection with one phenotype or one group of phenotypes. These polygenic dispositions are what I call pleiotropy. It means they have many effects. So IQ, higher IQ, also associated with autism spectrum disorders. Manic depression, also associated with creativity. There was a paper in Nature Human Behaviour that I had to write a commentary on. They developed a polygenic score that predicted same-sex behaviour, having sexual activity with the same person. It was also associated with high levels of risk-taking, more openness to experience, higher levels of charisma, and more female partners if you're male. So the problem with your scenario is that you're going to get these packages, which are first of all scientifically complex to unravel, and secondly difficult to normatively evaluate. Like, do I want to have a child that is more prone to same-sex behaviour, more risk-taking, more open to experience? Do I want to have a child that is going to be more likely to have autism spectrum disorders, but also more intelligent? It's difficult to weigh those things. So I think that's going to be the complicated thing with polygenic editing, as opposed to single gene editing. And I think we don't have a way of, first of all, scientifically, robustly evaluating that, and secondly, how to think about it normatively. Now, maybe you just leave those sorts of cases to parents. I'm a big fan of procreative autonomy in these cases. Leave that to parents to decide. Or what currently happens is it's just banned because it's not a clear disease.
So let me say a couple of things in response to this. So number one, Julian said that safety is going to be taken care of, right? Safety is a non-issue ultimately, eventually. It seems to me that we should keep track of safety and what work safety does as number one, as a domain of technical judgment in which other sorts of considerations are separated off from them. But number two is as a sort of what functions, generally speaking, as a sort of gatekeeping move to answering larger questions before, the technology is right. In other words, you sort of don't have to think about it until the safety problem is addressed. I appreciate the suggestion that that's a temporary problem and therefore we ought to be asking the ethical question. I think that was a very important part of that paper in Nature, because the can often gets kicked down the road because, of the sort of questions of technical plausibility, which are really expert interventions to essentially shut down more complex ethical debate. Okay, so those are two things. But another thing worth keeping track of with respect to safety is that we define that in operational terms, right? I mean, is a drug safe or not safe? Well, really, I mean, the sort of referent for that is a clinical trial that was designed in a particular way that addressed certain sorts of questions that didn't address other questions. I mean, is the drug that the average 70-year-old takes along with 9 other pills every day safe in combination with those pills? I mean, we don't actually have any idea because we didn't ask that question when we evaluated the safety of that particular drug in treatment-naive individuals who are only on that drug to evaluate its quote-unquote safety, right? Okay, so let's take heritable genome editing as a safety problem. When would we know that a particular intervention is safe? I mean, when did we know that IVF was safe? Actually, kind of, we still don't, because we never actually did do that clinical trial, right? How about intracytoplasmic sperm injection with direct injection of sperm a day? Nope, we never actually asked that question either. We can look retrospectively and say, well, kind of epidemiologically, you kind of can't see too much there, but there are some things actually, and there are various confounding factors and et cetera, et cetera. What about so-called mitochondrial replacement, which is a radical reconstruction of the embryo that is being done? Well, actually, we know that one is definitely not safe for some subset of the people who are produced through that process, because we know it's not going to be effective in its primary purpose, which at least initially in this country has been for the prevention of transmission of mitochondrial disease. We just know that. We know that. We can't say exactly why that is or which specific cases, but some sort of norm of reproductive autonomy channeled through the history of access to reproductive technologies that kind of became normative simply through the deployment of those into societies that took them up and used them. I mean, that is sort of the normative background to the adoption of the next thing, because it's not so different from how we did it with the previous things. But what if we were to apply our own standards of quote-unquote safety, which of course are ethical standards, like we shouldn't deploy drugs into society that we haven't tested properly, right? What if we applied that to the reproductive technologies we already have? We wouldn't have them, right? I mean, because how can you do a clinical trial with, say, 5,000 people where you want to look at the developmental effects, if any, of the use of a particular reproductive technology as applied to those people, where it has no direct, I mean, it doesn't cure anything because they weren't there until you did the thing to it, right? I mean, in the case of heritable genome editing, you're either editing a single cell embryo or you're editing gametes. You're bringing the person into being as a component of the experiment that you're conducting on the person, which also somehow weirdly excuses you from asking that person's consent because they aren't there yet, right? So the Nuffield Council, we're around the corner from Nuffield College. The Nuffield Council, which is sort of the UK's public bioethics body, in its evaluation of reproductive applications of genome editing, said very clearly the report is not opposed to the use of this technology. Okay, it sees potential warrant for the use of it, but it is very clear that this is not something that you could conceptualize as a treatment. Rather, it is the fulfillment of a reproductive desire. You want a child with whatever, with some genetic change. You may have very good reason for it, like you don't want a child with spinal muscular atrophy or something like that. But that is a reproductive desire that you are fulfilling through the use of this technology. So even if we go to the safety concept, it's just not clear to me for even the most basic, simple, straightforward applications, how you could ever actually ask the safety question in the way that we have settled upon a very mundane, bureaucratic biomedical research practice of defining safety you would have to carve out an exception and say, well, we can do point, we can edit a point mutation in a way that seems to not have off-target effects, and we can be fairly confident that we're not going to change anything, and therefore we can, sort of by proxy, presume that the result of this is going to be a healthy child. But that's making a set of leaps, and you have to have an ethical warrant for making that set of leaps. Now let's go into the polygenic domain, in which everything is some sort of complex constellation, and is probably, for the reasons of pleiotropy that you pointed to, we don't actually know what's going to happen with this constellation of 9 or 19 or 99 different factors, but actually those 9 or 19 or 99 are sitting inside of a genome. We don't actually know anything about the relationship between that particular genome and this particular constellation. So that constellation is actually, at least potentially, massively complex constellation, and every intervention will be a de novo intervention. Is there a planet on which it would be acceptable to produce a child just to see whether it worked, right? Because that is basically what any intervention that follows that process would entail. So even, it seems to me, on the level of safety, we're in extremely deep and complex ethical territory. And there is no, or there ought not be, any delegating of that question to a set of pointy-headed technical experts who can say, oh yeah, we know how the molecules work. We can assure you, you don't need to worry about that. It's cool. That, it seems to me, is a profound dereliction of collective responsibility if we approach things that way. And we're not even talking about things beyond safety at this point, right?
So can I suggest, in the interest of time, so Julian, if you have a brief response to the point about safety, and then I know there is a question.
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what you said, and that safety is a value judgment about what is safe enough, and I agree with a lot of your concerns about evaluating safety. It's also important to recognise that we're living in a different world to the world of the past. So I agree with you about IVFs, intracytoplasmic sperm rejection. You're talking about a scenario in the future where you've got AI, you've got in vitro gametogenesis, 100 embryos, you've got very precise whole genome sequencing with a lot of knowledge about it. Now, I don't know whether that would cross your safety threshold or not, but as you've said, we often apply a very rough and ready safety threshold. And the question is, why should we hold this to a higher level? And I'll finish with this. In the end, this sort of question is like crossing a river. Right? And on the other side of the river, there's beautiful palm trees, gold mines, beautiful fruit, and you're in an arid desert. And you've got to evaluate the strength of the current, whether there's piranha or crocodiles and sea snakes. At the end of the day, you've got to decide whether you jump. Now, you probably won't jump, I probably will jump. But that's the story of humanity. And, we don't know what happened to these children from China, maybe Bill does, and whether they have off-target mutations, what their life is like. But humans are curious, they will experiment, they will try to be better, and someone will do it, as we've already seen, and we'll see. We'll see whether you're right, whether they're monsters, that something terrible happens, or we'll see whether it's effective. So I don't think, I think the jury's out.
So let me do a quick response to this. So number one, we'll see. Seeing requires forms of organization, right? Is this not what science is? Certain forms of social organization in which one forms professional communities and establishes journals so that other eyes can be put on whatever claims you're making and then subject them to organized skepticism, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Seeing, number one, requires forms of social organization that, just a bunch of people doing a bunch of stuff doesn't allow. CF, the problem of IVF, which is in effect a large number of people doing a large number of the same thing, but never looking back at it systematically, and so we have to kind of reconstruct it in less than perfect ways. That's one point, but I think that's an important point, right? Because there is a certain kind of responsibility associated with a certain sorts of organization that one would require in order to do a thing responsibly. And just to say, well, it's going to be done. Well, I like to use the example of human rights. It's really striking to me how often the argument, somebody somewhere is going to do it, and therefore it's going to be done, and therefore it should be done in a way that's more responsible than maybe the irresponsible people are going to do it. Take note that it took all of 48 hours for the US National Academy and the Royal Society to take exactly that position in response to the Chinese babies, right? We were talking about whether this should be done. Now we need to articulate what would be a quote responsible translational pathway for bringing heritable genome editing into the clinic. That is a project that they undertook in response to that development. The river had been crossed. Now the rest of us have to cross the river too, and we just have to figure out maybe was there a better way to cross the river than the river was crossed. But I mean, if you put that in like a human rights frame, there are human rights violations happening somewhere. We should abandon the discourse of human rights, and we should sort of figure out what kind of guardrails we can put on the world that make things like not as bad as they would be, as opposed to a kind of category. And so the prohibition doesn't prevent action from taking place somewhere else. Does that mean that you abandon the prohibition as ineffective? So that it seems to me is an important question. How we think about what effective governance in a domain like this is in relation to some conception of the ethical responsibilities of a community to figure out what they think ought or ought not be done, and to give articulation to that, whether or not it manages to control what actually happens out there in the world. But the last thing, and it seems to me that what this all comes down to, is that the paradise on the other side of the river, that one does have to ask the question of, who's seeing that paradise, and is that paradise a mirage, right? Because imagining futures is a way that we articulate better and worse, right? That is in effect what the Eugenic project was about, was imagining a better future that created imperatives of action that would reshape the society of now so that it was less of a desert and more of a paradise. And the ways that those that seeing across the river are or are not subjected to critical reflection on, how are we going to figure out whether this is actually a mirage or this is a true better over there.
Just briefly, very briefly. So you mentioned this Herjavec experiment and this, well, is it a mirage over there or not? Here's how you could evaluate safety ethically. You take an embryo with Tay-Sachs disease, which is lethal in the first couple of years of life, and you gene edit that embryo because you've got nothing to lose, and that individual has something to gain, potentially curable lethal disease. And you might say, oh, well, we don't really know whether, not having Tay-Sachs disease is a mirage or not. Well, no, it's pretty clear that it's a terrible condition.
You're saying create a child that might die of Tay-Sachs in order to see if you can fix it.
You've got people who have religious objections to destroying embryos.
Isn't that what you just proposed?
I didn't say create one. I said people who have religious objections to destroying embryos, who are infertile, who actually create one embryo with Tay-Sachs disease. You can experiment on that embryo. Right? So that's your ethical way of doing it. That's your translational pathway. And you can do whole genome sequencing, you can do ultrasound, you can do enormous numbers of tests to see, and that, in my view, would have been an ethical conduct of human genome editing. Now, George Daly, the Dean of Harvard Medical School, said as much, but then added, we could also do it for Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a different condition where 40 normal years, where you could completely destroy those normal 40 years. But in the case of Tay-Sachs, you're not destroying anything. So this is, a way in which you could start to evaluate safety. Now, I agree with you, it's a big issue, but I don't think it's such an intractable issue as you're proposing.
So we might want to open for discussion because we have not much time. Sorry.